before a tournament, when you're actually building your affirmative or your negative case, there's a certain structure that almost every single Lincoln Douglas debate case is going to follow. And this structure is important because it follows the rules of LD and it provides a very clear logical train of thought for the judge to follow in order for him or her to vote your way at the end of the round. So the first and most important part of a Lincoln Douglas debate case is your value. I already talked about values earlier. It's just the most important thing in a round, the highest ideal, something, and you want your side of the resolution to support your value. If you're the affirmative, you want to show how upholding the resolution leads to your value. And if you're the negative, you want to show how the resolution harms your value, and flipping the resolution, if the resolution is liberal arts over practical skills, as the negative, you want to show how practical skills actually achieves your value better than liberal arts. So that's what a value is. Now, a value link and criterion are a bit of subcategory under value. A criterion is if you have a very abstract value like justice, then a criterion is simply a more concrete way of showing how that value works itself out in the world. So if your value is justice, your criterion might be something like improved government, because improved government means better laws, better justice system, better police, and that provides more justice for people. So that's an example of criterion. And then
you don't have to cover it.
All right, and then so a value link just is it's kind of like a criterion where you explain more how your value links to your side of the resolution. Value link and criterion are kind of the same things, but you'll hear both terms in a debate rounds. One debater might call it a value link. One debater might call it a criterion. They're basically the same thing, but it's just good to be aware that they are called. It's called both ways.
Okay, so after you've figured out what your value is and after you've established what that is, you're then going to move on to your definitions, resolution analysis, and contentions. And this is basically the meat of what your case actually is. So let's move on straight to those definitions. Now, at the very, very beginning of your case, you're going to provide some sort of hook or opener to grab your judge's attention. This hook or opener will a lot of times sort of explain or expound upon what you're actually going to talk about. But after you've provided that quote or that anecdote, you're then going to define terms. Now, the reason why you want definitions is so that there's no mix-up of what you're actually talking about. So it's very clear that you're talking about a specific thing in reference to those big terms in the resolution. Now, when you have your definitions should be clear and fair, but pointing to your position. Now, you don't want your definitions to be completely biased to your side of the resolution. As the affirmative, if you were to get up and define liberal arts as something that's great and wonderful that everybody should have in all their education, that wouldn't be a fair definition, and it definitely would lead to your position, but it's not something that provides ground for both of the debaters. The definition that you provide should be something that is debatable, something that is true about actually what that term is, but you can define it in a way that points to your position. Now, while this is not required, you want sources and citations that are credible and are not operationally defined. Now, what operationally defined means is that it's kind of like what you made up, what you feel like that term means. Now, while that can be good, and while sometimes you can't really find a great definition for a term, operationally defining can be nice, but a lot of times for those really big terms in the resolutions, you want to make sure that you have a source or citation. So it's not just your opinion on what that means, but it's somebody else's as well. So for the affirmative side of the resolution, you should have definitions for all of the key words in the resolution. So Josh was talking to you about the resolution of last year, and one of the resolutions was in formal education, liberal arts ought to be valued above practical skills. So the affirmative might get up there and define what formal education means, and define what liberal arts and what practical skills means. Those are all the key words in the resolution. But however, you also want to make sure that you have a paper with backup definitions. So valued above or over or should, all those little words can actually sometimes have a huge impact on the round. Sometimes negative teams will get up there and say, well, over means something different and they didn't actually define it, so I can define it however I want. So as the affirmative, you want to make sure you have some backup definitions and you have definitions for those little extraneous words in the resolution. Now, you don't have to state those backup definitions when you're actually reading aloud your case, but you can have them back at the table or with you, so you can redefine if you need to. Now, as the negative, you want to have a sheet of important backup definitions. Now, for the negative, you also want to have definitions for those key words like practical skills and liberal arts. And the reason why is if the affirmative team stands up and defines liberal arts or practical skills or those key words in a very unfair way, you can come up and redefine them. But if you don't have that definition on paper, you're not really going to be able to use it in the round. So you want to make sure that you have those with you. But you only want to redefine that definition if it's unfair, unclear, or you want to add to what has already been said. You need a reason why you're going to redefine those terms. Some of the most popular reasons why you can redefine is that it makes it more clear and that it's a more credible source. Now, you can't just come up and say, Judge, I want to redefine this term because I can and I want to and I want a different definition. You have to give an actual real reason why. You can also use that it's unclear, you can use that it's an unfair definition, or you can say they operationally defined it, it's their opinion, I'm going to provide a more credible source. This is what it actually means. So as the negative, if you do decide to redefine something, you need to have a reason for it instead of just saying, well, I just want to redefine it just because I can. Now, after you've provided your definitions and your opening quote, you're going to then provide a resolutional analysis. Now, a resolutional analysis should clarify your definitions, your position, and what your opponent's position should be. So basically, as the name implies, it's an analysis of what the resolution. It's saying the resolution means that I, as the affirmative, only have to do this, and the negative has to do this to win the debate round. It makes it very clear on what each side has to do. Now, a resolutional analysis tells the judge what you are and are not debating. Now, common examples of what a resolutional analysis title might be is it might be burdens. It may say that, as the affirmative, I have to prove this, and if I do, then I win the debate round. And the negative has to prove X, Y, and Z, and if they do that, then they win the debate round. It's very clear and straightforward. Now, a second example is a non-exclusive resolution. Now, what this means is as the affirmative, you might come in and say, well, the resolution's not exclusive. And what that means is that I don't have to prove that liberal arts should be valued above practical skills 100% of the time. I just have to say that it should be valued above practical skills most of the time. So resolutional analysis is clarifying. And also a third example of what some resolutional analysis would be like is that of conflict. Now, some people come up and say, when we're talking about liberal arts and practical skills, we're only discussing when they're in conflict, when we have to choose one. Not when they could be valued over another, but when we have to choose one or the other. So resolutional analysis provides clarity in the debate round, and this goes right after your definitions and before your value. Now, after you have your opener, your definitions, your resolutional analysis, and you've provided your value, you then need to support all of that. You need to have arguments in support of the resolution and in support of the value that you provided. Now, the fancy term in LD for that is a contention. Now, contentions are basically just arguments in support of the resolution or negating the resolution. Now, a good case usually has 2 to 3 contentions, so 2 to 3 separate arguments that are built up that support your side. Now, you also want to have a tagline for your contention, just a brief summary of what that contention is. A tagline is a brief explanation of your main argument and summarizes what your point will be. A good tagline is 5 words, and it should be something that is easy to remember and refer to. You don't want to have a tagline that's maybe 2 sentences long. It's not like a topic sentence in an essay. It's more of a very maybe short phrase or very short sentence that quickly summarizes what you're going to say. It also makes it a lot easier to remember and a lot easier to write down if you are a judge. Now, after you tag, you have 2 or 3 statements of analysis. So basically, a lot of the times how contentions go, if you're the affirmative, you may say that my side of the resolution supports my value as your first contention, and then you provide analysis and examples under that. And your second contention might be that the negative side of the resolution does not support or promote my value. So you can basically split up those arguments and make each argument clear and concise. And so it doesn't have a lot of extraneous information, and it should be very pointed as well. So the next thing you want to do after you've created your flow of arguments and your logic, you have to provide support for those arguments. You can't just say your tagline, and you can't just say it and then expect people to believe it. You actually have to support it. Now, there are several different ways you can support it, but there are three main types of things that people do in Lincoln-Douglas debate. The first is that of real-world examples. The second is that of quotes, and finally there are analogies. So all three of these are ways that you can provide support for the argument that you made and for the contentions that you have. So the first thing is these real-world examples. Now, when you're choosing a real-world example, you want to make sure that it's actually relevant, and your example should clearly correlate to your side of the resolution and your case. So real-world examples are basically things that have happened in the past, in the recent past or the very long past. These are things that already have happened that prove that your contention or your argument in support of the resolution is actually true. But when you do that, you want to make sure that it's actually relevant to what you're talking about. Say the resolution is that cats are better than dogs, and you bring up a piece of evidence or real-world example that say hamsters are better than dogs. Now that wouldn't be a good piece or a good example because it's not actually relevant. Somebody may have an example of that and it may be real world, but you want to make sure that it actually applies to what you're talking about. Now along with that, you want to make sure that it's actually straightforward. You don't want it to be confusing or complicated. And if it's more than 20 to 30 seconds to explain your example, then you probably shouldn't be using this. Now, you may have this really great idea for an example that you want to use, but if there are a lot of loopholes that you have to jump through to get there and it takes you a really long time to explain how it actually applies to resolution, how it's relevant, and how it supports your side, you probably shouldn't use it. There should be no question in the judge's or your opponent's mind that it actually supports your side of the resolution. You also want to make sure that it is credibly sourced. Now, the example that you choose should have sufficient evidence to prove that it existed if asked. You don't want to maybe find something on a blog post and you don't have it with you and you come up and say, well, someone somewhere says that this happened. You want to make sure that there's enough information out there that you can actually find that information and that people can believe that it actually happened. You also want to actually understand it, and this is key. It's okay to be confused and ask questions at first, but if you really just don't understand the example at the end of the day, you don't want to put it in your case. And the reason is that you're not going to be able to re-explain it or defend that example if you really don't know what it is. Even if there's this really great debater that says, hey, you should use this example for your case because it's great. Don't use it if you don't understand it. You want to be able to understand it. You want to be able to explain it and defend it. An example is no use if it is just knocked down after the first speech. You want to be able to defend it, and the only way you can do that is if you actually understand what it's talking about. So don't be afraid to say, I don't really understand this example. And after you've asked questions and you still don't understand it, it's okay to discard that example. Just make sure that you actually understand it. Now, the second way you can support something is through quotes. But if you do use a quote, you do want to make sure that it directly links to what you're actually saying. You may have this great piece of rhetoric from some really fancy guy who says something, but if it doesn't actually link to what you're saying, it is of no use. You really want to analyze that quote. Ask yourself, what does that quote actually mean? What is it saying? And you also want to think about, why am I using this quote? You want to make sure that it actually says what you want it to say. You also want it to be short. When you're reading it aloud at a comfortable pace, you don't want it to be longer than 20 to 40 seconds. If it takes longer than that, it's going to eat up too much of your case time and too much of your speaking time. You want it to be short and concise, and you want it to actually directly link to your argument or your point. Now, the third way you can support the resolution or kind of flush out some of that logic is through analogies. Now, your analogies should only be used to explain a concept or argument. Your analogy should be fairly simple and something that the judge can relate to. Now, a lot of times in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, it deals with these complex theories and things that people don't really understand. One way that is helpful in order to break those to use analogies, but you only want to use something that the judge can relate to. It's no use to bring up this really nice analogy if the judge doesn't understand the comparative objects that you're using. You also don't want it to be so complicated that it actually confuses the judge more. So if you do decide to use analogies, you want to make sure that they're simple. Analogies can be very effective in Lincoln-Douglas debate. They can make it so that it breaks down complex arguments, it makes it a little bit more interesting to watch, but you need to be careful when using them because you want to make sure that they apply and you want to make sure that they're not too complex or too confusing. Now, here are some types of support that you can use by their priority. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. These are just different ways that you can use to support your arguments. Now, the first thing you can use is an expert. You can use a quote from an expert, and this is a person that is knowledgeable in a specific area and has credentials. Now, if you're quoting somebody that isn't an expert in that field, that quote doesn't carry much weight. You want to quote somebody who actually knows what they're talking about and has been educated in it. The second type of support is a source document. So you can talk about the Constitution says something or the Declaration of Independence. Talk about how maybe the idea that you're discussing is not just something you made up, it's something that other people in the past have also created and supported as well. The third type is the news. You can use one that is commonly associated as being reliable if you do use a news source. And finally, in Lincoln-Douglas debate, you can use a philosopher. If you do use a philosopher, though, you want to make sure that that person is actually respected and a well-known philosopher. So these are just 4 main ways that you can find that support, find that quote, find that real-world example, or that analogy. So that is all we have.